Well, let's bring in Greg Sheridan, foreign editor at the Australian newspaper. Greg, a very good afternoon to you, and heaps to talk about today. Let's start with Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi finally agreeing with what many Democrats have been urging her to do, and that's to back an impeachment inquiry. It's all about this phone call between Donald Trump and the Ukrainian president. We haven't seen yet the transcript of the call, but what do you make of this development? Is this a sensible move now from the Democrats, or a pretty big gamble?
I think the Democrats and CNN on one side and Donald Trump on the other, they're like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, you know. They need each other. They're dancing a complex duet together, and the Democrats need Trump to outrage their base, and Trump needs the Democrats to outrage his base. I will be truly astonished if Trump has been so foolish as to say something in this phone conversation which is a slam dunk case of him committing illegality.
He says he's happy to have it released now, this transcript. I mean, what does that tell us?
Well, you know, he probably is. And probably the transcript won't show him in a terribly good light. All of these Trump scandals start the same, as though they're sort of, you know, the rape of the Sabines or something, the outrage of the innocent and so forth. And they end up generally being, you know, just something in bad taste or whatever. The impeachment, you know, I venture this bold prediction: Trump is not going to lose office as a result of impeachment. And it will allow him to associate Joe Biden with an atmosphere of scandal, because Biden was vice president, his son was on a board.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. I mean, yeah, how much of this damages Joe Biden along the way? Well,
because, you know, Trump benefits enormously from his enemies. He drives his enemies completely barking mad. He drives them nuts. And that's one of his greatest political skills. Then they wildly overreact, so that the bad things Trump says, the lukewarm things Trump says, and even the good things Trump says become to them an offence, a tremendous offence. And so Trump's supporters hate the mainstream media. They hate the Democrats. They think they're all telling lies all the time, and they think the worst of them. So if Joe Biden is associated with an atmosphere of scandal, even if it turns out that Biden, like Trump, is innocent of legal wrongdoing, then everyone will say, well, you know, Biden, you're running simply because you're allegedly morally superior to Trump, but you're not really morally superior to Trump. In other words, you get a replay of Hillary Clinton. Now, the Democrats ought to be smart enough to work out that that's what Trump is going to do to them. But nonetheless, I think by, you know, moving this impeachment, they probably help Trump to some extent, rather than hurt him.
Yeah, look, I guess we'll see what's in this transcript. If there is evidence there that he's trying to extort or bribe you know, a foreign power to damage his political opponent, fair enough, he's in a lot of trouble then. But,
sure.
Boy, if not, then the Democrats may well have overreached. Let's turn to Boris Johnson. This court ruling, a unanimous court ruling, well, it is more than embarrassing, isn't it, Greg?
I don't know. I don't think it's true to say that they've found that he misled the Queen. He didn't offer the Queen any reasons for proroguing at all. I'd put it in a slightly different context. I'd say that every element of the British establishment will bend every sinew to stop Brexit, including the courts. I think Johnson is damaged by this ruling, plainly, but nonetheless, at the end of the day, what he wants is a contest where he is championing the people and Brexit against the power of the establishment. And Parliament was going to come back anyway in plenty of time to do whatever it wants to do about Brexit. It's had 3 years to do anything it wants to do about Brexit, to pass any legislation or any resolution or anything you like. At the moment, Johnson's opponents won't hold an election. So this is pretty bizarre. You talk about breaching convention. Here is a Prime Minister who doesn't have the numbers in the House of Commons, and the House of Commons is saying, we have no confidence in you, but we are determined you must stay in office because we're worried that you might win an election. So I think it is damaging to
It's a pretty
Johnson.
strange turn of events when any opposition resists having an election, right? Normally oppositions are itching for an election at any time. But just to pick up on one thing you said there, and I mean, we're talking about the Supreme Court judges here unanimously deciding this. Is the suggestion that they're somehow in on this, trying to stop Brexit?
Well, I certainly make no personal criticism of these Supreme Court judges or anything, but the highest court in England and Wales unanimously ruled that it was okay. So this is the terrible mess you get into, David, when you get politics mixed up in the courts, because the judges are superbly qualified to rule on the law. They're not at all qualified to rule on political questions. And the highest court in England and Wales previously ruled, and the Supreme Court has now overturned them, that they had no jurisdiction at all to get involved in this. But what we've seen, a la the European Court of Justice, and very much influenced by European trends, the courts have become more activist, and they've held the view that it's their role to dispense justice more or less regardless of the law. Now, you know, they're smarter at law than I am. Who am I to criticise them? But the judges are drawn from the same tiny elite group within society, that they all go to the same dinner parties, they all have the same views about Brexit. Everyone above a certain income level in Britain is violently opposed to Brexit. The courts have been increasingly activist in Britain, as is the European tradition, but is not the British tradition. And every convention which supports Brexit is overturned, and every convention which hurts Brexit is upheld. So the convention that governments can prorogue parliaments whenever they like has just been overturned, and the judges just seem to have ruled that it's against democracy to prorogue parliament. So I don't know where that comes in black letter law.
I've got to get your thoughts too, Greg, on the Australia-China relationship right now. I mean, Scott Morrison's been saying things that he, in fairness, has been saying for a few months, but perhaps a little more bluntly in relation to China being a developed country. And we just heard a Chinese professor who's visiting Australia at the moment, you know, have some pretty strong warnings that Australia needs to be careful and so on. I would note that yesterday Marise Payne met with her Chinese counterpart on the sidelines of the UN, and Xinhua, the state-run news agency in China, has been briefed on the meeting and says that Wang Yi, the foreign minister, noted Australia's positive statements on China recently, particularly by Australian PM Scott Morrison, who said China was a partner, not a threat to Australia. So they're running the story that, you know, the meeting was fairly positive between the two foreign ministers. I don't know, what do you think about where things have turned to this week?
I've got no criticism of Morrison here. I am a bit disturbed. If I was Gladys Liu, I'd be very unhappy that the Chinese government keeps saying, you know, God bless Scott Morrison for defending Gladys Liu. I think that's a bit worrying for her. But look, I thought Simon Birmingham engaged in an absolute train wreck of an interview with you today. He will encourage the Chinese to be bullies because he refused to repeat his own Prime Minister's words. His Prime Minister says in so many words what everybody knows: China is a developed economy. And his Trade Minister, Simon Birmingham, runs away from it, going down all kinds of verbal weasel holes to avoid repeating it. Now, that kind of inconsistency is much more damaging to Australia's position than anything Morrison has done. But the other big trouble out of this week, I think, is for Albanese. I mean, Penny Wong was in Jakarta saying the WTO is not fit for purpose. Australia, like other nations, are very concerned about Chinese intellectual property theft, cyber attacks, militarisation of the South China Sea and so forth. And there's Albo saying the WTO is working fine, China is a developing economy, Morrison is wrong to attack them. So the open question out of this week is, has Albanese deserted the normal bipartisanism on key strategic matters? Of course, China doesn't like the fact that we object to its practices in trade, but we have disagreements with China. That's okay. Morrison was not extravagant in his language. In fact, I think there was some confusion because Morrison didn't sort of spell it out in, you know, words of one syllable. This is new. This is something I've said before. This is something that Trump agrees with. This is something that Trump disagrees with. So the poor old, you know, travelling media and so forth were having enormous difficulty interpreting what it all meant. But I don't think Australia-China relations have gone backward this week, but I do think Australia-US relations have gone forward. If the Chinese are smart enough to invite Morrison to visit them, they'll get a good visit just like the Americans did.
Yeah, one thing I think you touched on well there, though, is that Australia collectively are not exactly holding a consistent line on China right now across the political spectrum. Greg, we'll have to leave it there. We'll catch up with you next week. Thanks so much for that.
Thanks, David.